Hello and welcome back to World Traveler Commentary. Today we're going to talk about the rise and fall of hyperglobalization as part of the series on the rise and fall of global liberalism. Now, what we're talking about with hyperglobalization is a shift that happened after the Cold War, which sought to economically integrate the entire world. Okay? Now, I think that it's very obvious that that period is over, that we're moving into a very different economic world today. And while the current war in Ukraine has not been the only factor involved, I think it marks pretty clearly the end of any possibility of hyperglobalization. So, basically, let's go back to like the 1980s, early 1990s, and what you find is that the primary economic cooperation between countries was governed by something called GATT, or the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. And GATT generally promoted free trade, but it did so in a way that gave countries a general ability to adopt protectionist measures if they so desired. Protectionist measures weren't necessarily seen as evil, they were just generally disfavored under GATT. In the aftermath of the Cold War, the United States underwent a great project to try to economically integrate the entire world, and so GATT went away and it was replaced with the World Trade Organization. The World Trade Organization was aimed at eliminating any barriers to international trade. So while GATT sought sort of a balancing act between possible needs for import tariffs and things like that, the World Trade Organization pretty much sought to eliminate as many of these barriers as possible because if we go back to this liberalist hypothesis, the liberalist hypothesis is that economic integration prevents war. Now, if you believe that, I got a bridge to sell you. If you're skeptical of that, good reason. Case in point, when you look at the rise of the tensions in World War I, the liberalist hypothesis would make you assume that there wasn't that much trade between the Central Powers and the Triple Entente. But in fact, there was massive amounts of trade. There was a large amount of integration. And so one of the things is that economic integration doesn't prevent war. Okay? It doesn't. There's very little dispute among historians that dependencies on trade don't prevent war. But, you know, in the aftermath of the Cold War, a lot of people believed that. They thought that globalism was going to lead to this perfectly peaceful world, and all we needed to do was to enact one regime change after another and deeply politically integrate the world. That hasn't worked so well, obviously. You can't bomb your way into a peaceful world. So, now, Mearsheimer's thesis in Rise and Fall of the Internet, or Bound to Fail, Rise and Fall of the International Liberal Order, is that economic globalization and hyperglobalization creates its own resistance to this because it allows capital to flow more freely across countries than labor. And in fact, when labor can move freely across countries, this drives down wages. So freedom of capital and freedom of labor both exacerbate the gap between the rich and poor. And this leads necessarily to resistance to hyperglobalization itself. And I think you see a lot of that. Okay, Mearsheimer is correct on this, but what Mearsheimer, I don't think, could really predict is what the effect of the current sanctions on Russia are going to be in relation to hyperglobalization and globalized trade. Now, this was because, of course, this article was written a few years ago. This wasn't really on the table. But what was going on at the time was that Russia was engaging in a very determined effort to try to sanction-proof their economy. They saw what sanctions had done to Iran, and they sought to try to eliminate or mitigate the impacts that Western sanctions would have. I personally knew people who were involved in PostgreSQL related businesses, for example, in Moscow, who had a whole lot of work moving companies from Oracle and SQL Server to Postgres. Why not? Why? Because companies were afraid of sanctions. So, open source software, which is very, 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 very hard to sanction, became one of the primary beneficiaries of all of this, right? And that's kind of funny because the resistance to globalization creates economic efforts which in some ways create a different form of globalization. Here, moving from globalized trade and software licenses to a different form of globalization found in open source software collaborative projects, right? So you still see a lot of collaboration even today with Russian contributors to many of the open source projects. And while this ruffles some feathers, I think that's a good thing. Common cause can create common culture, and it helps us to continue to talk about issues and hopefully eventually create resolutions. And informal networks are built on intangibles like this are virtually impossible for governments to sanction in this way. The only thing governments can do is cut themselves off. They could say, we won't use open source software because it might have contributions from our enemies. But that doesn't even work. Governments are so dependent on open source these days that they can't fight that. So one thing that is pretty apparent is that the end of globalization, as we think of it in terms of commerce, is leading to a different kind of globalization, which I think is better. I'll get to that in a moment. So, coming back to the question of sanctions. In 2014, Russia began a program to build their own equivalent to the SWIFT network. Fearing, of course, that SWIFT could be used against them, which it has been, and fearing, of course, that this would have implications for many people buying Russian goods around the world, which of course it has, they built their own system. Now, with the sanctions, this puts a lot of pressure, for example, on African countries who want to pay for grain and things like that from Russia to integrate directly with the Russian banking system. So Russia has pieces in place, and now offers an alternative to a Western-controlled monopoly. So what's going on here is that there is this effort at sanction proofing, right? And that doesn't mean you won't have some forms of globalization. It doesn't mean you won't have some forms of hyperglobalization, but it means that there is almost certainly a massive turning away from Western monopolies when it comes to global trade. Okay? I'm going to say that again. There's almost certainly going to be a turning away from Western monopolies when it comes to global trade. And that means financial monopolies, it means energy monopolies, it means aircraft monopolies, and this is really good news for China, for Russia, and for a number of other countries in the long term, although Russia's going to suffer quite a lot in the short to mid-range. So then, if we're still seeing all this globalization, why do I call this the end of the hyper-globalized era? The reason is the World Trade Organization cannot function. Okay? It cannot function in a world where a significant part of the great powers are trying to disentangle themselves from other great powers, right? The United States can't be trying to disentangle itself from China and expect that the World Trade Organization is going to be able to function, right? The United States can't even disentangle itself from Russia. The European Union certainly can't, and expect that the World Trade Organization is going to function. Because the whole purpose of the World Trade Organization is to keep that from happening, right? And so suddenly what we've seen is a Western turn against hyperglobalization. And what I think is going to replace it is a return to controlled globalization based on national interests. More realist approach. With the exception that international telecommunications is making it easier and easier for collaborative projects relating to intangibles to be built together. So we will continue to see sort of a weird form of hyperglobalization in the form of open source. And this is a sort of thing that governments are very ill-equipped to handle, because what are you going to do? I mean, how can you do anything? How can you say an Iranian software developer can't contribute to, say, the Linux kernel or to PostgreSQL or some other project, right? You can't. You can't control all of these projects in this way. And all you can really do is you can control the business entities which do business around that software, right, within your own country, but they're still dependent upon this global network of developers, and they're not in a position to do anything about it. So we will continue to see people working together across areas like this. You'll still see Russians, Ukrainians working together on open source software. You will still see people from around the world contributing to the Linux kernel without regard to any of these divisions, because there is no there's no way to stop it, right? And because the consequences of not doing so as a software professional means that this part of the industry you're just simply cutting yourself off from. So And this becomes kind of funny because, having been involved in managing open source software projects when, we had major contributors in different countries that were threatening to go to war with each other, in that case Venezuela and Colombia, kind of showed how sort of continuing to come together and work on common projects can help to keep our interactions with each other human and humane. And so I think that there's a positive aspect there, right? The US government might wish that Russians didn't contribute to PostgreSQL, to Linux kernel, to other things, but frankly, it's not their decision and they don't have a way of stopping it. So where I'm going with all of this is that the liberalist idea that all we need to do is integrate the world failed, right? There was an attempt to do this in the EU with the Eurozone. That has not led to political integration. It has not led to fiscal integration. It's only led to a series of fights and arguments between states, right? There's a question really of what's going to become of the Eurozone after COVID, after this war, things like that. I don't know. It's hard to predict the future. I think that we should try to remain relatively humble on those points. But what is pretty clear is that the idea that capital gets to travel across borders freely, and that we should be effectively ending national borders as economic control areas, is effectively over. And where we're likely to still see sort of a hyperglobalization is in informal, non-commercial exchanges of intangibles. Because in that case, there's literally no handle that people have on controlling it, right? You can't control the money because there's no money that's exchanged. You can't control physical goods and services because there's no physical goods and services exchanged, right? You can't. So then the question is, what can you do? You could, and I actually don't see an option there. But then I think that's a good thing. I think that we still have to be able to talk to each other. But I don't think it's going to stop wars. So, even before the war broke out in Ukraine, we were moving into an area of rapid de-globalization. That really started under the Trump administration in the US, but it's begun pretty much many parts of the world, right? And it's closely tied with this decline of liberal democracy. The war in Ukraine has shown the game for what it is and basically made it impossible for this hyperglobalization to continue. So, if nothing else, this is perhaps a knife in the chest of a dying patient, right? This is, this form of hyperglobalization is now over. Frankly, good riddance. So that's all I have for you today.